Hey guys, in this episode I'm going to show you how you can take your third person camera, zoom into a first person point of view, and then zoom back out again basically as far as you want to go. Hey guys, welcome to today's episode. And in this episode, we're building on our blueprint knowledge that we started last episode. We're going to end up creating two new components on our third person character blueprint. One for a camera boom, which stabilizes our camera, and the second for a brand new camera, and that's for our first person point of view. And at the end of the episode, to tie all the functionality together, I'm going to show you a new piece of functionality called a macro. Macros are very similar to the functions we learned about last episode, but they have some advantages and some disadvantages where, depending on the situation, it might make sense to use a function versus a macro. So we'll go over those differences. So here are the key concepts I want you to take away from this episode. A lot of these are review, very similar to what we did last episode, but we are taking it up a notch. It's going to be a little bit more complicated. And for our last one, macros, that's going to be brand new functionality. So let's get to it. All right, welcome to today's episode. And today we're going to be working in our third person character blueprint that we started last episode. And so if you navigate down to your content drawer, you can find your third person character blueprint under core if you followed along with our third episode, which is 2 episodes ago. And I'm just going to double click to go into that. And this episode, we're going to focus on 2 specific components within our third person character blueprint, the camera boom and the follow camera. And I want to start out by first talking about what these 2 are and how they're attached to our character through our capsule component. So last episode we talked about the capsule component. Basically it's simplified collision around our character, and both of these things you can see that they're attached to the capsule component because they're indented relative to that thing, and if I collapse the capsule then I can see everything underneath it. In the camera boom, it's basically an arm, in this case a virtual arm, that connects our camera to our player. And we could set that to be a specific distance away from our player. And right now, the target arm length is set to 400. If I go to the viewport, I can actually visualize that. So I can see our camera there on the left-hand side. And I could change that to, let's say, 100, and it's much, much closer to our character there. But I could put it right back to 400. And our follow camera component, this is literally the virtual camera that our character is seeing the game through. And to be honest, I don't know a lot about digital photography, but in the details panel here, basically everything you can think of in terms of what a real digital camera would have would be found here. So things like bloom and exposure, you could put a dirt mask on the camera, stuff like that. So for example, if you wanted a film noir game that was taking place in the 1950s and you wanted to make it black and white and a little bit grainy, you could do that all from the camera here, and you wouldn't need to adjust every individual actor separately to be black and white. So now let's go back to what we wanted to accomplish this episode. So this episode I wanted to create a toggle, but in this case really a mouse wheel scroll, to go into first person point of view and out to third person point of view once again. So the obvious way to do that would be, well, for a camera boom, instead of setting that target arm length to be 4 meters away, why not just set it to 0 right in our player, compile, save, and then we'll go ahead and play. And there we go. We've got a camera, we've got ourselves directly inside the stomach of our metal friend here, and now we're reenacting Krang from the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I guess I'm dating myself with that reference, huh? So let's go back to our third person camera, and I'm going to change that target arm length to 400 again. So for the camera boom, instead of having that be attached to the player's stomach, we could move that up, right? We could have it be attached to the player's head, so that when the camera zooms in to the player's head, that it's more like the first person point of view. So let's test that out. So if I grab our z-axis here and I just change the translation a little bit, so maybe up to about eye level, which puts it right about there. I change the target arm length to 0. And actually, let's move it out a little bit so I'm not actually looking at our character's skull, or the interior of his skull. Compile and save. And let's go ahead and play. Well, that's looking pretty good, right? And then, oh, that's not looking so good. So what's going on here is our camera is moving completely independently of our character, which is fine in the third person point of view, right? So if I go back to our third person character here, if I change this to, let's say, target arm length 300, compile and save, I'll show you what I mean. So when I'm playing, when I'm in play mode, that's exactly what we want to have happen, right? So we want our character to be able to move independently of our camera. So just by moving my mouse around, I'm able to see the entirety of my player, and I'm actually able to move in the direction that I want to using W, A, S, and D. But we don't want that to happen when we're in first-person point of view, right? Because most first-person point of view games, in fact, I think every single first-person point of view game that I've played, when you turn your mouse, you are literally turning your character. So it's not just the camera, it's your character itself that's turning. So how do we do that? So if you navigate to the main third-person character blueprint, and you come over here on the right-hand side, and you select this Use Controller Rotation Yaw, that's what's going to control the camera being attached to the rotation of the player. So let's test that out. I'm going to go back to our camera boom. I'm going to set this again to, let's say, 20. So it's right in the character's head. Compile and save. Let's give it one more time. So now, all right, I'm looking down, and look at that. So our character is actually changing direction relative to the way that my camera is facing. And that's exactly what I want here. But we see when I lean forward a little bit, I could still see my head. So my settings are not quite where I want them to be. So let's go back to our third-person character. And I'm going to lower our camera slightly. Let's lower it down here. And let's move it out just a tiny bit more. Let's see how that does. Yeah, so now we're talking. To me, that feels like we are our first person now. I can see my hands. Let's see when I jump. Yeah, I can see my hands when I jump. See my shadow. It really does feel like me now. Yeah, I occasionally see my head, but very rarely. All right, so now we have a good understanding of really the three settings that we need to change in order to properly move our third-person camera into a first-person camera. And one is that target arm length, which is the distance from our camera to our player, or its attached location. And the second is the physical location, like the transform of that camera. And the third is that third-person character, the Use Controller Rotation Yaw setting. So we have two ways we could do this, right? We could just change each of those three settings over the course of a mouse wheel scrolling. Or instead, what we could do is we could use two different camera and camera boom components. And I thought about this a lot, and I think it actually makes sense to have a separate camera boom and a separate follow camera for first-person point of view compared to third-person point of view. Because if we have a separate one, we can just flip a switch and it's just one setting to switch from one to the other, versus several settings to manage between them. Because you heard me say earlier, we're going to have situations in our game where one switch, I want the game to automatically toggle between the third-person and first-person point of view. And so for that, I think it's just going to be simpler to have a separate set of camera boom and follow camera. So the first thing I'm going to do that is I'm going to right-click on Camera Boom. We're just going to rename these. So instead of just Camera Boom, I'm going to make it the first-person point of view Camera Boom. And the same thing for our follow camera. Right-click, rename, and I'm just going to put FPP for first-person point of view follow camera. And so now I'm going to select both by holding Control, and then I can right-click, and there is an option to duplicate, but I noticed that some settings got thrown off whenever I did that. So I'm just going to hit Copy instead, come up to our capsule component, which these are both attached to, and I can right-click and paste. All right, so now we have our second set of the camera and the boom. But this, again, I'm going to rename it. So I'm going to rename it to our third-person point of view camera and camera boom. And the same thing here. So what do we need to adjust now to get our third-person camera and camera boom back into position? Well, I still want the simulation of zooming in to our character. And so I really want that pivot point to be very close to where it is here. I am going to move it a little bit back, though, because I'm going to try to put that pivot in the center of gravity of our player. So I'm going to select the camera boom, and I'm just going to put that right in the center. Because if it's not in the center, when you're rotating around the character, it's going to feel weird, because then the pivot's not actually in the center of your character. All right, so after we've got our pivot, now I've got to set our target arm length, and that's going to be, let's say, 300. And the next thing I'm going to do, I just want to test this third-person camera. So I'm going to go to our third-person character here. I'm going to uncheck that Use Controller Rotation Yaw. And then I'm just going to navigate to our first-person camera. And I want to deactivate that because you can only have one camera active at any given time. So I'm going to unselect this Auto Activate. And this way, we can test out our new third-person camera and just make sure that works as expected. So I can minimize, play. And there we go. So it's a little bit higher than it was before, right? But to be honest, I kind of like that because I'm seeing more of the view of our player and what's going on around outside of our player. All right, so now we're ready to set up our toggle between our third-person point of view camera and the first-person point of view. So how do we do that? Well, if we go back to our event graph, and we can continue right where we left off last episode, right underneath our walk-run toggle, and we can do something very similar this episode. So at first, I'm just going to start with a single keyboard button. So if I right-click, and you can really search for any keyboard button here, but let's say I search for keyboard T. Got to scroll up a little bit to find it. There it is. And this is just to test things out until we get the mouse wheel scroll working. So when T is pressed, this is where I'm going to want it to change from our first person point of view to third person or vice versa. So how do we do that? Well, first we need to assess which is active. And so the way I'm going to do that is I can drag in our first person point of view follow camera as a reference, and we need to get a variable on this. And remember what variable we just selected. So we just selected this auto activate. So if I drag off a pin and I search for is active, so that is assessing whether or not our first person point of view camera is currently active. And you see that it's returning a Boolean. And so how do we assess whether that's true or false? It's the same thing we did last episode, right? We can do a branch, and then I can connect that up. So that's first, when I press T, it's going to assess our first person point of view follow camera and whether or not it's active. And then if it is active, what do we want it to do? And then if it's not active, what do we want it to do? So let's say it is active. So what do we want to have happen in that case? Well, in that case, we want our third person follow camera to be activated, right? So I can drag that in and I can activate it. So if I search for activate, and then I can connect that up, but we can't have both cameras active simultaneously, right? So we have to also inactivate our first person point of view camera. So I can get another reference there, drag off, and search for deactivate. And there we go. Now I'm going to connect these up. But we also have the false branch, right? So if it's not active, what do we want to have happen? Well, we just want to switch these two things, right? So I can highlight all of these. I can do Control-C to copy, Control-V paste, and I can connect these to the false branch. But now what we want to activate is actually our first person follow camera. There's a neat trick here. So how to disconnect one of these pins, or any pin. If you hold Alt and you left click on one of those pins, it just disconnects it. So it's Alt, left click. And then I can drag our first person camera reference over, do the same thing for our third person camera reference, connect those up, because now we're switching it, right? We want to activate our first person view, deactivate our third person. All right, so now let's try this. I think we're ready to test it out. So compile and save and minimize. And let's play. So now I'm going to hit T. You ready? There we go. But look, what is the setting I forgot to change? If we go back to our third person character, I forgot to also switch that setting that's down here, use controller rotation yaw, right? Because our rotation is still independent of the actual character. So how do we do that? I actually don't need to get a reference this time because we're not referencing a specific component on the actor. We're referencing the actor itself. All of these variables are on the actor itself. So for that, I can just search for use controller rotation yaw directly. So if I right click and I say use controller rotation yaw, and I'm going to set that down here and attach this up. And then when we switch over to third person point of view, do we want to have that checked? Well, let's check. No, we don't want to have it checked, right? Only when we're in first person point of view. So I can select that, Control-C to copy, Control-V paste. I'm going to connect it up, and we are going to have that checked when I'm in first person point of view. Compile, save, let's test it out one more time. So here we go. So I'm running around, everything's good. T, oh look at that, my body is rotating wonderfully, and I can see my beautiful shadow illuminated under the bright blue sky. Waxing poetic. All right, let's go back to our blueprint. So we've got our initial setup here. We know how to switch from our first person to third person camera. And so really, if we didn't need a scroll to go in and out, this would be basically done at this point. You would just have a switch. And for those situations in game where a cutscene occurs and I want the scene to be played from inside the character's head and you're seeing it from their perspective, this could work just fine. I could make all this a function and then reference that function when I play that cutscene. But in our case, I told you I want to do a mouse wheel scroll in and then out again. So it's a little bit more complicated. So how do we do that? Well, the first thing is I'm going to get rid of the T here because we're not going to have a single button for that. We're going to have our mouse wheel. But what did we do last episode to set our own button, really whatever we wanted, to be that event, to be that action? Well, we've got to go into our action mapping. So I'll go into settings and then I'll go to project settings just like we did last episode. If I search for action up here, and we can create a brand new action mapping, and this one is going to be for the mouse wheel scroll. But it's actually going to be two actions, right? Because we need one for scrolling in and then one for scrolling out. So I'm going to call this one camera zoom in, and I'm going to search for our mouse wheel, and this is going to be mouse wheel up, and then we also need our camera zoom out. So create a new action mapping, camera zoom out. And this is going to be our mouse wheel down. And if you're using a gamepad or something like that, and you want to add an additional control for zooming in and out, you could just hit the plus sign here, and there you go as the second option. All right, so we got our two new events, mouse wheel up and down. So I'm going to go back to our blueprint. And how do we reference those? Well, we right-click anywhere on the open space. I'm just going to search for mouse wheel, or no, that's not right. I'm going to say zoom. There we go. Camera zoom in. There's our input action. And then I can also search for our camera zoom out. All right, so now we're going to set up our zoom in first. And the setup between these is going to be very similar. We're just going to set up one and then duplicate a lot for the other, but just in the opposite direction. But the first thing let's talk about in relation to this is how sensitive do we want the zoom to actually be? So what the zoom is going to do, in effect, is for that third-person camera, it's going to adjust this target arm length in increments. So it's going to get closer and closer and closer to the character, and then once it hits a certain threshold, it's then going to say deactivate our third-person camera and switch over to our first-person camera, right? And vice versa. When we zoom out, it's going to deactivate the first-person camera and then switch over to the third-person camera and zoom out, zoom out, zoom out. But we have to figure out, okay, how much do we want each tiny little measure of the mouse wheel actually zooming in and out, right? So just like I'm doing here on our event graph, we got to figure out how sensitive that should be. And I did a lot of playing around with this just to see what works well. And because our target arm length by default is like 300 or 400, I recommend increments of 30 or 40. So that's what I'm going to do here. But here's another question. So for our player, when our player is actually playing the game, do we want them to be able to control how quickly they zoom in and zoom out? And I think the answer to that should be yes, because I think players appreciate that kind of control. So what do we need to do to enable that to be changed, that sensitivity? We need to create a variable, just like we did last episode. So if I come over here to variables and I hit plus sign, and I'm going to call this our mouse zoom sensitivity. And right now it's a Boolean. What do I need to change this to? Well, I've got to change it to whatever our third person and first person camera booms are. If I look at this, it has a decimal point. So that means it's a float. So if I come back to our variable type, I can change that to a float. Compile and save. All right, so now I'm going to create some space just so I can build all of this out. So when our camera is zooming in, what do we want to have happen? Well, we want to shorten the distance that our third person camera boom is, right? But here's the thing. If we're already in first person view and we zoom in, what should happen? Nothing, right? So I think the first thing we've got to check is whether or not the player is currently in the first person point of view. So we can actually steal our logic from whether or not that first person camera is active. So I'm going to hold Alt and I'm going to disconnect these two pins. And then I can drag that logic over. And that's what we're going to assess as soon as the mouse wheel begins to zoom in. So when that's pressed, it's going to assess whether or not we're in the first person point of view. And what do we want to have happen if I'm zooming in and I'm in the first person point of view? nothing, right? So we don't want anything to change whatsoever. There's nothing to zoom into. You're already in first person. All right, so that's true. Nothing's going to happen. It's only if it's false that we want the zoom in to do something. So what do we want it to do when we zoom in that case? We want it to adjust our third person camera boom length, right? So I can come up to our camera boom, drag that in, get a reference. And what do we need to reference? Well, we need the target arm length. And we need to get the current length because we don't know what the current length is without getting it. So we get that arm length. And then what are we doing to this target arm length? We're zooming in, right? So we want to shorten the length of that arm. We want to shorten the distance from the camera to our target, to our player. So we need to do some math, right? We need to subtract. So I can drag off a pin and I can just search for minus sign or subtract. And that's going to get a subtraction node. And what are we subtracting now from the target arm length? Well, we're subtracting our mouse zoom sensitivity. But I forgot to give this a default value, right? So this is going to be changeable in our game, but by default, I want it to be about 30 like we discussed. And I can compile and save. And now I'm going to drag that variable into our event graph, drop, and we're going to get that. And so what this is going to do is, let's say our target arm length is 300 currently, and then we're zooming in. So presuming we're not in first person view already, then it's going to take our 300, it's going to subtract our sensitivity, which is 30 in this case. And then what do we need to do? We need to set a new target arm length, right? So I'm going to drag out a pin here and I can say, oh, actually I can't set it directly because if I search for set target arm length, there's nothing there. Why? Because the target arm length isn't on our actor. It's actually on our camera boom. And that's the necessity of having the reference to things. So drag out our camera boom and now I can get our target arm length. But this time I'm setting it, right? So I got it, I subtracted 30 from it, and now I'm setting it to be the new value. So I can connect this up, and I can also connect up our false pin here, because again, when it's true, if I'm already in first person, don't want it to do anything. I'm just going to organize this a little bit, get rid of some of the spaghetti. I always try to keep this as clean as I can. All right, that looks pretty good. I'll move our zoom out down here. But now let's think about this a little bit more. So it's 270 when I subtract 30, and then I'm going to zoom in more. It becomes 240 and 210 and 180 and da-da-da-da-da. And then what's going to happen when we get a certain distance to our player? We want to set a threshold, right, by which we switch from the third person camera to our first person camera. Because if we pass that threshold, so if we get within, let's say, 30 units of our player, we want it to go boop and turn off our third-person camera and then turn on our first-person camera. So that's what we need to do after this, right? We need to assess whether or not this value is below a certain threshold. I'm going to set that threshold to 40 units. So I can drag out a pin and I can say if this threshold is less than 40. And I just search for the less than sign on my keyboard. And if it is less than 40, what do we want to have happen? Well, we need to switch the cameras, right? So I got to make a branch first to assess whether it's true or false. Connect that up. If it's false, if it's not less than 40, let's say it just went from 300 to 270, do we need to do anything else? We don't need to do anything else, right? Because we're just adjusting the target arm length, so it's already going to be a little bit closer. It's only in the true branch that we need to actually change our cameras. So that's where we can connect up some of this here. So in that case, we could take our TPP follow camera, activate that, and deactivate our other one. Let me actually drag out the second one down here because that's going to be in our other case. And I'll connect these up to our true right over here. All right, so now let me actually trace through all of our logic so you have a good understanding of how this is working. So when we're zooming in, so let's pretend we're 300 units, about 3 meters behind the player with the camera, right? So we're zooming in. And the first thing it's checking is our first person point of view camera active? If it's already active, we don't need to do anything else, right? We're already zoomed in all the way into our first person view. But if it's not active, if that's false, then it's saying, okay, get our current target arm length of that third person point of view camera boom. And also get our mouse zoom sensitivity here. And we got to subtract the zoom sensitivity from that target arm length. So we set that to 30. So it's saying, okay, this is 300, subtract 30. That's going to be 270 coming out of this. And then it goes into the new target arm length. So it's updating this variable. And then it's checking, okay, is our target arm length less than 40? Because if we get too close to our character, then it's assessing that. And if it's false, it does nothing at all. It's just shortening that distance between the camera and the player. But if it's true, then it's activating our third person. Oh, that's wrong, right? So I'm doing the wrong thing here. So I need to switch this out. So this is going to come down here, and this one is going to come up here, because what we need to activate is actually our first person camera, right? So let's come up here. All right, so now we can test this out. So compile and save. And now I'm going to use my mouse wheel to zoom in. Because keep in mind, we didn't do anything with zoom out. So zoom in 1. Oh, a little bit closer, a little bit closer, a little bit closer. Dude. Is it going to switch to first person? Not yet. Ta-da! And we are in first person point of view. And our character movement is working. How wonderful. All right, I think we're set there. Now I'm trying to zoom out and nothing's working because we didn't yet set this guy up. So when we zoom out, how is this going to differ from the zooming in? Well, the first thing that we need to check is whether or not our first person camera is active. Because if our first person camera is active, then we need to switch from our first person to third person, right? So once again, we can use the same logic that we have up here. So I just need to highlight that, Control-C, copy, Control-V, paste. But in this case, we want it to do something regardless of whether it's true or false, right? It's just going to do something different. So if it's false, then it's going to zoom out. And if it's true, it's going to actually switch the camera over and potentially zoom out. So let me make some more space here. I'm going to select all that, drag it down. And now I'm going to take our nodes over here, move them over. And if this is true, that's exactly what we're going to do to start. So then we're going to activate our third person camera, deactivate our first person camera, and set use controller rotation yaw back to false. And that's going to pop us back into the third person view. But what do we want to have happen if our first person camera is already inactivated, meaning this is already false? So in that case, we're already in third person view, right? So then we just need to adjust our camera boom. So I can move up here and I could take our existing setup that's already here for adjusting our target arm length and come down here and Control-C, copy, Control-V, paste, and I can connect this up. But in this case, are we subtracting from our target arm length? No, right? We're adding the zoom sensitivity to it. So I can select that minus sign node, delete that, and instead drag off and search for add or plus sign. And I'm going to connect up our mouse zoom sensitivity, connect that up to our target arm length, and then compile and save. Now we're ready to test this. Perhaps our final test, play. And I can still zoom in, and that looks good. First person body, rotating just fine, and then zoom out. Probably want to adjust the zoom out a little bit, because when I start zooming out, I can still see my character's head a little bit. Probably need to push that out a little bit more. But then we can zoom out and continue zooming 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 out. I'm just messing around, guys. But basically, we could zoom out as far as we want. But we probably don't want that to actually be the case in our game, right? So we probably need to readjust that target arm length or do what's called a clamp. So let's go back into our third person character blueprint. And so we need to set some sort of limitation on how long this target arm length can get, right? So we could do this via a branch node, right? So we could have the false dragged out and say, if target arm length is greater than some threshold, say like 400 or 500, then don't do anything and only increase the arm length if it's less than that threshold. But there's an easier way of doing this that I want to show you, and it's a feature called a clamp. And basically what a clamp does is it prevents a certain value, like an integer or a float, from exceeding a certain threshold or dropping below a certain threshold. And so we can drag out from our pin here and search for clamp, and we're going to do a float clamp. And then I can connect this up to the target arm length. And I probably want to set this to something like, let's say 600, minimum of 0 distance and a maximum of 600. So let's compile and save that, and we'll try this again. So I can still zoom in, and then I zoom out, and that's basically the limit as to how much I can zoom out. So I can zoom out a little bit, but not that much. Now, let's go in and fix that other issue. So the issue that you saw was that when we first start to zoom out from first person into third person, the camera is still technically in front of our character. So we want to change that. So let's go back into our third person camera boom here. If you go to our viewport, you could see that that third person camera boom is actually linked to our character in front of the character. Really, we're going to change the position of that link. So if I select that axis and I drag that to be 0, kind of right in the middle of our character, compile and save. Let's try this out one more time. So now I'm moving around, zoom in. Yep, that's good in first person. And then zooming out. Yep. So if I zoom out the smallest amount, I'm just right in front of his back, and that's perfect. Excellent. All right. So we're good there. And so now let's go back to our event graph. And in this case, we probably only need to clamp our third person camera zoom out, because that's when the number is actually increasing. But you know, anytime you're changing a number of some kind and you're increasing that or decreasing it, almost always it's good practice to clamp it, just so it never gets beyond a certain value. I don't think it's going to be an issue up here, but just in case this number, this target arm length, ever could become a negative number, we probably want to clamp that as well. So if you drag off a pin from the minus sign, do another clamp, same thing, so float, and we want to clamp it to the same threshold. So down here we set 0 to 600, and we want to do the same thing here, 0 to 600. Compile and save. And then we can zoom out and admire our wonderful spaghetti, which isn't too bad, but this is the most complicated logic and blueprints we've done yet, right? And so based on last episode, we should probably collapse this to a function. But you heard me say last episode that one of the main advantages of functions are that they're reusable outside of the blueprint. And for this, for specifically the mouse zoom in and the mouse zoom out, I'm actually not anticipating using that functionality outside of this blueprint. And the reason is that it's the mouse that's doing it. And we might want to change from a third person camera view to a first person and vice versa, but that's not going to be handled this way. We're going to have some other function that we create to do that where it happens instantaneously. And so for this, because we don't need to reference it outside of this blueprint, it's really intended for our player, for our third person character. I think we could use a different functionality instead called a macro. And macros are very similar to functions, but I want to go over some of the differences between the two so you know when to use a function and when to use a macro. So functions have the advantage that they can be referenced, they can be called outside of the blueprint. They can be referenced from basically anywhere in the game. And macros don't have that. So you would think, well, why ever use a macro? But macros have some functionality that's not available in functions. So for example, delay nodes, which we'll get into probably in about 10 or 15 episodes. Delay nodes are really useful because you can set a certain amount of time to pass before executing the next node in the string of nodes you want to have happen. And you could do that in a macro, but you can't do that in a function. And also macros can have multiple execution pins, so they can actually run more than one string of events that happen along the chain. So in summary, I tend to use macros for any features that are most likely not going to be referenced outside of the blueprint. So how do we collapse our functionality into a macro? Well, it's the same way we did with a function. So you can hold left click, drag, highlight everything, and then once it's all highlighted, right click, and directly underneath collapse to function, we have collapse to macro. And so for macros, once I get it into position, I can reference those on the left-hand side here directly underneath functions. So I've got my new macro 0. I want to rename that. I'm going to right-click, select rename, and we're going to call this our camera mouse wheel zoom in. And then we could do the same thing for our second set of functionality. You can highlight that, right-click, collapse to macro, and we can also bring these a little bit closer together. This one I'm going to title camera mouse wheel zoom out. There we go. So what should I do now that I've collapsed all this functionality? Well, let's comment it. So I can highlight it, C to comment, and then I'm going to call this my camera mouse wheel zoom and switch to between first and third person. Compile and save. So if I go into those macros, I can go into them just by double clicking on one. And there's our macro functionality. I'm just going to drag out the input. What's cool about macros is that, like I said, you can have multiple execution pins. So you could potentially have more than one of these that are doing different things depending on what comes into it. So I could just add another execution pin with this plus sign up here. We're not going to do that right now, but in the future we might have more elaborate macros. And then for the output, Really, you only need to hook this up if you want the macro to do something after the fact. So in our case, we don't need the zoom in to do anything after the macro. So we don't really need to hook up that output over here. But you could just do this in the future. All right, I'm going to close out of that macro. I'll just go into our other macro, and I'm just going to rearrange this, make it nice and neat. Put our output there, even though it's not connected. Compile and save. Close out of that. All right, last thing, we're going to organize our build again. So we've got our mouse zoom sensitivity, and that variable we're going to classify under camera, and there's already a setting for camera. And that's going to place that variable along with our two components for our camera. And we've also got additional components up here that we created, so let's classify those too also under camera. There we go. That's one and our second. Compile, save. And same with our macros. So category, camera, category, camera. Now let's do one final test. So save our entire level and play. And then let's test zooming out. Yep, looks good. So we can zoom in all the way to first person. We are good to go. So that concludes today's episode. But in our next episode, we're going to pivot completely, and we're going to start working on our level environments, starting with landscapes. And so, I'll see you in the next one.